It's our pleasure to welcome now former chairman of the Mississippi GOP, Lucien Smith. Hey, Lucien, good to see you, man.
Hey, it's good to see you, Gerard. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so we're down to the old proverbial fish or cut bait next Tuesday, Election Day. Rhino and I have been analyzing the candidates and their last-ditch efforts to appeal to the electorate. Kamala Harris, of course, decides that the appropriate venue for her closing arguments would be at the Ellipse there in Washington. And the left-wing media in this country, particularly MSNBC, they're absolutely on cloud nine about this deal. They're giddy about it. They said it was her best speech effort ever. And honestly, okay, I could grade it that way. But the message of Donald Trump's just bad, 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 and all these bad things are going to happen to you. People want to hear, I believe, how are you going to solve my problems?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why the Harris campaign is seeing their numbers get softer, why you're starting to see the trend move towards Donald Trump. Is just that. I mean, the MSNBC crowd, in my mind, they're involved in this giant LARP, which, for anybody who's not familiar, live action role play. This is where you go dress up like you're a knight and fight medieval battles out in the forest somewhere. And if that's your scene, that's great. But I feel like that's what all these folks are doing. They are LARPing the end of American democracy. They're all you see these reporters on MSNBC seriously saying, if Trump wins, maybe 6 weeks from now, we're all going to be in jail. That's not true. And I think for those folks, I'm not surprised that MSNBC thought she gave a phenomenal speech and that it's great messaging because it's very consistent with this liberal LARP that Donald Trump is essentially Adolf Hitler and American democracy is going to end next Tuesday if he's elected. But I think you're absolutely right. Regular Americans are concerned about what are you going to do to improve the economic situation in this country, to secure the border, to make my family have a better, more secure, more prosperous life. And that's not what she's talking about. But it's also the same messaging, essentially, we have heard about Donald Trump from the second he started to get traction in the Republican primary 8 years ago, or really 9 years ago. That's when that messaging started. And if at this point, if a decade in, you've heard Donald Trump is a wannabe dictator who's going to take over the country and abolish democracy, and you're still undecided, I don't think that's a closing argument that's going to have you go, well, now that I've heard it for the 155th time, now I'm going to come around and vote against Donald Trump.
It's unique, is it not, Lucien, in that we have two candidates vying for the presidency, both of whom have a history in the White House.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that is exactly right. It's a long time. It's been about a century since we've seen a situation where you had a former president running. But the Harris campaign, in my mind, is trying to run this very similarly to the 2020 election, or at least that's what they've tried to do, in the sense that Harris has not done a ton of media outside of that really appealed to swing voters. She's not put herself in a particularly vulnerable situation. You saw she refused to do the Joe Rogan podcast. And she is essentially trying to run a race on I'm not Trump. Well, I think that works when Donald Trump is the sitting president. If people are unhappy with his style or his substance, you can say, here, let's have some change. But it's essentially impossible, I think, for the sitting vice president of the United States to say, let's have change, vote for the current administration. And that's the gist of what they're saying. And she can't, I don't think she can do this factually, but she can't practically come out and say, well, here are all the things that I would do differently from Joe Biden, but he wouldn't let me do. I don't think that has actually happened, but I don't think she really practically can say that politically, because then you lose, then you have the potential of somebody pointing out that you're probably lying, and B, it opens up a whole sideshow that takes attention away from the campaign. So it is, to the extent this is a change election, which I think it probably is, that benefits Donald Trump.
Yeah. You know as well as I do, when you're a candidate at any level, but in particular of president, you've got to talk about a lot of things that you'd like to get done, sort of in the context of I will do this. But we have this little thing called the Constitution and the lawmaking that prescribes the lawmaking process, and there's a limit, and we want it to be limited on what a single individual as a president can do. But nonetheless, Donald Trump does invest a lot of cycles in talking about things he will do.
Right.
And Harris and the Democrats, they put their focus on all the bad things that will happen to you if Donald Trump's elected. You rarely hear her say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You don't hear anything along those lines.
No, that's right. And I think there's a reason for that. That in my view, not that this is particularly revelatory, but the Democratic Party is completely captured by its leftist base.
Yeah.
The sort of university crowd, the elite coastal crowd, the people who live in the wealthiest suburbs, the wealthiest zip codes in the United States.
Yeah.
And they have a set of views that are very, very liberal. And the Democratic Party, and this has been a shift you've seen somewhat in both parties, but I think the Democrats are more guilty of it than the Republicans. I'm not completely unbiased there. But it used to be you would run towards your extreme in the primary. The most conservative Republican tends to win. The most liberal Democrat tends to win their primaries. And then in the general, you would moderate and come back to the middle.
Yeah.
What the Democrats have chosen to do is not moderate at all in the general election. And there's a little bit of it. I mean, she said, oh, well, I really don't hate fracking now, but I don't think anybody takes her seriously on some of those things. But it's to stay on the extreme left, but then try to get that center vote not by being moderate, but by convincing the moderates that the other guy is so terrible you can't possibly vote for him.
Yeah.
And so I think she doesn't want to talk substance because Democrats lose when they talk about what their real policy positions are. I mean, if Kamala Harris wants to go out and obviously sometimes she'll just lie about it. She's going to secure the border now, she says, after 4 years of being the border czar and refusing to secure the border and letting more illegals into this country than the entire population of the state of Mississippi over and over and over again. But I think if she actually talked about what they've done the last 4 years and what they'll continue to do if she's essentially reelected, that loses her votes. You just can't go to swing voters in this country and say we're going to have an unsecured border, we're going to try to raise taxes, we're going to continue pouring cash on an inflation problem and causing it to get worse, and have people vote for you. And so I think she's got to talk about you can't vote for Donald Trump because he's bad for democracy. And I'll be honest, Gerard, that has made me more enthusiastic about voting for Donald Trump than I have been any of the 3 times he's been on the ballot, because I think the lesson the Democrats will learn if they win this time is they've got to destroy the Republicans. And you started to see it happening early in this cycle in the primary when DeSantis in particular looked like he had a chance of winning over Trump. There were already articles getting written in places like The Atlantic, which is owned by a Democratic billionaire super donor who likes to sell narratives, and she said as much. She likes to publish narratives that help Democrats. You started to see these articles that said, DeSantis is even worse than Trump. He's the Caesar to Trump's Sulla. I mean, he's the real authoritarian. And I think they've always called. Republicans have been called Hitler, or they've been Hitler comparisons going back, I think, to Dwight Eisenhower.
That's right.
You're going to see. That is going to be the standard every single election, whoever the nominee is. Y'all save this audio and pull it up in 4 years. Whoever the Republican nominee is in 4 years is going to be worse than Trump, a true authoritarian, and the biggest threat to American democracy we've ever seen.
So you don't believe that if they do get their butt handed to them next Tuesday, you don't believe they'll pivot on their strategy here, that they will continue to employ this fear-mongering and, as Rhino and I have been talking about, really just doubling down on identity politics?
I think they're just so captive to that extremist base, I don't know if they can get away from it. And that is that it's been interesting to watch institutions that are left-leaning get canceled for not being left-leaning enough.
Yeah.
And I think that would be the fear if I'm a leader of the Democratic Party right now, that if we said, okay, maybe we should move back to the sort of centrism of Bill Clinton that helped us be politically successful in the 90s, you'd have a bunch of people on the far left who'd go, well, you've left us, you're terrible, you're a fascist too, we're going to go vote for some new party.
Even James Carville is pointing that out to him.
Absolutely.
He's scolding them on it.
Absolutely. But it is because so much of the party is dominated by a group of people that I don't think has ever left university campuses.
Seems like
San Francisco, New York. I mean, they are totally disconnected from the American heartland.
Which is ground zero for the ideology and the agenda.
Exactly. That's where it's coming from. And it's why you see these hokey things they're doing, like with Tim Walz, as though somehow the way to get American working-class voters is all they have to see is you cracking a Miller Lite and looking at a TV screen with football on it, and they're going to go, oh, shucks, maybe there ought to be boys in my girl's high school bathroom.
We got Lucien Smith in the Element Well studios. Stay with us. We're coming right back. So, Rhino, I was talking earlier about this report I saw about voters in Arizona. There's a big abortion measure on the ballot in Arizona, of course, a key battleground state. I'm looking at a photo, as a matter of fact, of the inside of the headquarters of the ballot initiative, the Abortion Access 139, as it is styled. But there are a number of voters, and by the way, this is an article in the Washington Post. That's who conducted the interviews with voters in Arizona, the Grand Canyon state, who say, yeah, I support the abortion rights referendum, which, by the way, would legalize abortion up until 24 weeks of gestation period. That's pretty deep into it. But he said this issue's, quote, super far down the list when deciding which presidential candidate to vote for, because he believes the decisions should stay in the state. This decision about abortion, which is what the Dobbs case essentially did, returned it to the state. And Trump has indicated that's where he stands. He supports that and believes that it should remain in the states. Of course, the Harris campaign, the Democrats are saying if Donald Trump's elected, he's going to completely ban abortion across all 50 states, and he's made it very clear, no, I think it ought to stay in the states, at the state level, which is where it is. But the point here is that there's half a dozen other voters they talked to, all of whom said, I'm supporting the abortion ballot measure, but I'm going to vote for Trump. Because there are some concerns that this measure could draw lots of Democrats who support abortion, and that could also benefit the top of the ticket. And that's reasonable.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it looks like a lot of people, and in fact, the Washington Post here says in their polls, about 30% of voters who are going to support Trump support some degree of access to abortion.
Well, again, this comes back to the conversation we had in the last segment about the way the Democratic Party is engaged in this national political LARPing. You know, we were told that when if the Dobbs decision came out the way we all expected it to, and Roe was overturned, we were going to literally be living in the Handmaid's Tale.
That's right.
This was going to become a Christian theocracy. Women were going to be violently oppressed by the state. Abortion was going to be something you'd get the death penalty for in all 50 states, which anybody with half a brain knew was just hooey.
Yeah.
That's not the word I would necessarily use if we weren't on the radio, but it was absolute hooey when they said that, and now you're starting to see it. And you know, all that decision did was allow states through their legislatures to decide what the abortion law ought to be, the same way that it's done all across the world, really.
Yeah.
Legislatures make these decisions because they're in a better position to than courts. So I don't think that's a surprise. We're now several years post-Dobbs, and I don't know about you, but I have not noticed that we're living in the Handmaid's Tale.
Right, exactly.
And so I think people may be abortion supporters, but I think the fear-mongering that was pre-Dobbs just hadn't proven to exist in fact after the fact. Yeah,
and I think we have to be objective as well, Lucien, that the Dobbs decision did not result in a reduction of abortions being performed in this country. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Right.
Abortions have actually increased. But what it does do is, if you feel strongly about this issue, you can choose a state to live in that aligns with your values in that respect. But more importantly, just strictly from a legal perspective, the Supreme Court got it wrong, and that's what this court said.
Well, that's absolutely right. There's actually, this scholarship used to get talked about. I don't think it's talked about as much anymore because nobody wants to admit it. But there was a school of thought in the legal academy that, and the political science world, that America pre-Roe was probably heading in a direction where there was much broader acceptance of abortion.
Yeah.
That the Roe decision really ossified views and strengthened the anti-abortion movement and made this a political issue that it's just not in most countries.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, courts just don't do a good job of deciding something like abortion. They do a good job of interpreting something that someone else has written, but the questions that naturally come up when you talk about when abortion ought to be prohibited, well, what's the difference between 12 and 24 weeks? What's the difference between 6 and 24 weeks? I have strong views on it. I'd rather see a ban essentially that starts the moment you could know that you were pregnant. Now, that's to the right of most people, but the way you settle, is Lucien right versus the people who think there ought to be a 24-week ban or even later than that, is through elected legislators, the legislators getting together, having a discussion, and deciding where they can compromise on what the moral cutoff ought to be for that. That's just better than having a judge try to decide what people would want, which is essentially what happened with Roe, and then the Casey decision was you had courts legislating, and in Dobbs they said, this really isn't something we ought to be doing. This doesn't have a basis in the Constitution. We're going to throw it back to legislatures to decide. And places like Mississippi and Florida and Texas have made good choices. In my view, places like New York have made bad choices. But that's the nature of the democratic process.
Yeah. It feels like this issue was influential in the midterms, but the wind has died in the sail there. Does it not?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think some evidence of that is the fact that it hasn't been a major talking point for the Harris campaign. You've seen some of it. I mean, she's said that if she's elected, they're going to have a national codification of Roe.
Right.
I question the constitutionality of that, but that really hadn't been the tip of the spear for them in terms of what they've been talking about, which I think has to show that, kind of like in Arizona, it is not a high-intensity issue for most voters.
Yeah. In fact, what she said is that she would support ending the filibuster, which is what would be required.
And that's what they want. I mean, I think she wants to do that regardless.
Yeah. I've shared this many times in my public speaking engagements and just get your take on it. Joe Manchin stood in the gap there.
Absolutely.
And would not allow the Democrats to essentially end the filibuster. And there's just a series of bad laws, honestly, that would have been passed. It's surreal to think about, isn't it, that one person ended up with that sort of power?
Look, Joe Manchin did a lot to preserve the republic. I absolutely agree. And it's frustrating. I mean, we've been on the other side of this. I think we're likely to pick up the Senate in the midterms. Excuse me, I think we're likely to pick up the Senate next week.
Yeah.
And so I think we will be in a position where this happens. It is frustrating to have good legislation you view as good, that's getting held up by the filibuster.
Yeah.
And so I do think over the course of if we are successful in winning the House and the White House, which is both are significant ifs, and then we've got the Senate, I think we're going to be in a position where we're going to be frustrated by the Democrats using the filibuster to block legislation.
Yeah.
And I suspect, because the media lets the Democrats get away with this sort of thing, we've heard how important it is to end the filibuster. If a Democratic filibuster of Republican legislation is suddenly the situation that we're living in, I think you're suddenly going to go back to the tapes from 20 years ago where you heard people like Chuck Schumer say the filibuster is a vital part of American democracy. It's what makes our republic work. We can't get rid of it because they're going to be so happy to use it. But
though he'd end it today if he could. He would end it today.
Absolutely end it today. But as soon as he's in the minority, it's going to be a different
and the floodgates would open. And I would caution Republicans, you may have a different take on this, that if you get into that position, such as control sufficient in the Senate, where if all Republicans voted to end the filibuster, you could do so, and you could pass lots of legislation that you think's good and you'd like to get done. Just remember, eventually the shoe's on the other foot.
Absolutely. And I'll say that now. I agree with you. We should preserve the filibuster.
I
agree.
agree.
It will be frustrating. There will be things that would be better for the country if we didn't have the filibuster.
I agree.
But I think it is an important feature of our republic that you can't pass federal legislation without significant support for it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the filibuster has that effect. You can't make major changes at the federal level unless you've got broad support in the Senate, and that's a feature, not a bug, of the American political system. The problem we've got, and this is much more pronounced on the left, but we've got some of it on the right, is people want the federal government to do too much.
Yeah.
The federal government needs to do less. These elections ought not be, who the president is really ought to be borderline irrelevant.
I totally agree with you.
He or she is supposed to be the chief magistrate who oversees the enforcement of the laws that have been passed in a small area that the Constitution gives Congress power to. And the reason these things are so fraught is because we now expect our federal government to do vastly more than it was ever intended to.
And let's not forget the commander-in-chief role and responsibility, which could be argued as the premier responsibility of the President of the United States, is to secure the dang country. Top of the list, more than anything.
That's exactly right. That's
we don't want
right.
really presidents get involved in pushing abortion policy, for example.
That's
and,
right.
And stuff like that.
Presidents aren't prime ministers. I mean, it's a different form of government. They're not the chief legislator, even though that is very much the way people think of the president and presidency right now.
Yeah. Let's continue talking about this in the next segment. We've got Lucien Smith, former chairman of the Mississippi GOP, in the Element Wealth studio. Mr. Trump right now is live in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, a critical battleground state. We're coming right back. Narrative. Why? It's what do you say all the time? It's about your feelings. You're too obsessed with your damn feelings. We got Lucien Smith, former chairman of the Mississippi GOP. Let's analyze a little bit the races. We were just talking about the filibuster as an example, and I'm with you. I'm for preserving it. I think it would be a bad move on the part of Republicans if they get in a position to do so, to end it, because, man, would the Democrats ever use that against us. And by the way, the map, as you know, a couple of years out, not quite as favorable to us in the Senate.
That's right. We're very likely to win. I mean, I fully expect us to take back the Senate next Tuesday, but a big part of that is because the map is in our favor. You know, you got seats up like Roger Wicker. I mean, Roger Wicker, who even if it were going to be a tough race, should absolutely win because he's done a good job for the state, and he's going to be the chairman of the Armed Services Committee after we win next Tuesday. But the map is not as favorable to us 2 years from now, and even if we pull it off 2 years from now and manage to maintain control of the Senate, at some point the Democrats are going to be in control again of the Senate. That we can pretty well guarantee. So we shouldn't make changes to the way the institution works to benefit us in the short term, because ultimately the shoe's going to be on the other foot. And they've seen it a little bit. You know, the Democrats are the ones who started eliminating the filibuster for judicial races, for judicial confirmations. We were ultimately the party that eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court confirmations, but we wouldn't have been able to do it and get Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch confirmed had the Democrats not first changed things such that you could start fiddling with the filibuster on the judicial side. So there will be huge pressure probably coming from President Trump if we have a Republican House and Republican Senate. But it would be a mistake to get rid of the filibuster because we will be in this position again.
Yeah, totally agree. You know, if you think about it, though, most of the legislation that would require overcoming the filibuster, I think, comes from the left. It's more radical in nature, such as expanding the Supreme Court. I mean, that's a huge
right.
Sweeping issue right there. We're not talking about just tax policy or reforming Social Security or Medicare, which also would require ending the filibuster. We're talking about rather radical events, such as that making D.C., Puerto Rico a state.
That's right. And it's like we were talking about in the last segment, a feature of our federal legislative system is that you cannot pass laws without broad support because you have to overcome that filibuster in the Senate. And so that's the reason I think most of the things that require eliminating the filibuster, you're right, are things that come from the left.
Radical.
Because they're radical things that just don't have broad support. Now, most people don't want to. Most people outside of the left-wing establishment don't want to see the Supreme Court expanded.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that's what we got to protect against. I do think we're going to have this epic battle next year with respect to the expiration of the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Little attention being paid to that at this point. Mr. Trump has chosen rather to focus on some tax cutting ideas that he has proposed. Tips, he was the first out of the gate on that. And I read the other day there was an individual that actually came up with the idea that advised him on it. It may have been somebody in Nevada, as a matter of fact, I want to say. But that idea in eliminating the tax on overtime, Social Security, he the other day announced that he'd like to expand the tax credit for elderly care when someone is providing caretaking services. There is such a law right now, but it's a very small, like $500 a year or something, tax credit. He wants to expand that. But he's been rather specific with that. Haven't heard a lot about keeping the Trump tax cuts in place, which I honestly believe actually saved Biden from having a much worse economy. If you think about his tax proposals, if they had been enacted replacing the existing Trump tax cuts, which have been in place throughout his entire presidency, we'd have had a much worse outcome.
That's a good point. And if somehow the tax cuts were repealed in 25, the way Vice President Harris has called for, that's going to have a significant negative economic consequence while we're already, in a perilous position. So I hope whoever wins that those end up getting extended.
Well, she continues to say nobody that makes over $400,000 a year, under $400,000 a year, would pay higher taxes, but no details, no specifics on that.
I also just don't think that's true. I mean, I think I know they say that. I don't think they've been able to provide any details. I also think, because so many small business owners work through a pass-through entity, there may be somebody who on paper is making $800,000 a year in income, but they're actually supporting a number of employees off of that $800,000. And so I think they say that, but what's going to in truth happen is a lot of people who are making a lot less than $400,000 are going to be negatively impacted directly or otherwise.
Well, from a pass-through business perspective, which again, that's the rocket fuel for our economy, these small, mid-sized businesses. I can tell you, man, there's a lot of those folks who, from a tax perspective, have to report all that income because it gets passed through. But you cannot equate that to the cash that went into their pocket.
Correct.
You can't just raid the company of all the cash equal to the amount of net income the company produced. That's a recipe for failure.
That's right. But the way that I think to use the vice president's term, I mean the way the vice president thinks of it, those are people who are making $2 million a year, so they can handle a little haircut, and that's just, you're right. It's factually inaccurate.
But that they prop that narrative up, and it seems to resonate with a lot of people. And again, they're preying on people with this class warfare and this division, and never talk about growing the pie, as I like to say. They always talk about just recutting the pie.
That's
Take
right.
some out of this, put it in this square over here, and that's really just not. And Mr. Trump talks a more growthy policy framework. And that's what we need.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's because there's a view on the left, and it does come from what I think is the creeping socialism in the Democratic Party, that people who are successful, who've taken the risk, who've gone out and who are making money in a profitable business, or somehow either they don't truly deserve it. I mean, you can go back to Obama's comment about you didn't build that.
Yeah.
Or two, there's something bad about that kind of success, and that they ought to be punished, and that they're exploiting the people who work in that company. And I guarantee you that the people who are able to feed their family because they work for a small business that someone went out and took an immense risk to start and then build, that they're thrilled that person went out and started that business, took that risk.
Absolutely.
Because it allows them to feed their family and have a successful life. And there's a hostility to that in the Democratic Party that I think is unhealthy for the country.
There's a tendency for them to always look at folks like that when they're at the end of that journey,
That's right.
and not when they began that journey. And the effort, the risk, the perseverance, the sacrifice, the long hours, all the above during the journey. It's just,
That's right.
You're here. Look at you. You got too much money. We need to take some of it, without considering everything that led up to that created that.
That's right. Well, and I think it's because so much of the policy decisions that get made in the Democratic Party are by people who've worked almost exclusively in government or the academy. True. And they've, people respond to incentives. There's no reason. I mean, most people don't go start a business just because they think, man, I mean, there are a lot of motivations that you do it. But I mean, one of the reasons that you go and start a business is because of the potential of a significant exit, or the potential of having a more control over your life and more income than you've got in a salary. But if you don't have that opportunity because government is going to tax the stew out of it, then there's really no reason to go take that risk.
Absolutely.
You ought to work a 9 to 5 and stay with the stable thing that you've got, rather than go do that if there's not an economic motivation to do it. And people respond to incentives. I mean, that's one of the fundamental lessons of economics.
Something I read yesterday is that the number of public companies in this country is about half of what it was in the mid-'90s. And that may not mean a lot to a lot of people, average people on the street, but it does mean a lot to your 401k plans and your investments. It means that there are companies that are opting not to go public, that are creating lots of value because they're innovating for society, and you're not able to participate in that upside as a stockholder, which you can in a public company.
That's a good point.
And a lot of that's because they look at the regulatory environment and the taxes and so forth and say, no, I don't want any part of that. And, of course, you got You got ideologues like Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders and Robert Reich and even Joe Biden that attack these companies all the time. They say, I don't want to subject myself to the scrutiny and all the goofy regulations where they're dictating to me what my board's got to look like and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, and you think about the Democrats love to talk about income inequality, but because of the accredited investor rules, a huge people who make less than $200,000 don't have the opportunity to invest in private companies lawfully. So you're taken to the middle and upper middle class gets locked out of something that wealthy people can invest in very easily.
Good point. I'm for ending that, honestly.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you at all.
Appreciate it, Lucien. Thanks for coming in, man.
Absolutely, Gerard. Great to see you.
We're coming right back, folks, with the final segment on middays in the